The gunshot echoed across the dusty plains of Redemption, Arizona, like the wrath of God himself, sending Margaret Valentino scrambling for cover behind the weathered tombstone of her recently buried husband. It was 1878, and the widow had barely finished mourning when lawlessness found its way to the small cemetery on the outskirts of town. "Stay down, madam," a deep voice commanded as another shot rang out, chipping stone fragments from her husband's grave marker. Dust swirled around her black mourning dress as she pressed her back against the cool granite, clutching wildflowers meant for Richard's grave. Through tears and terror, she glimpsed a tall figure diving behind a nearby oak tree, revolver drawn. His movements were fluid, practiced a man accustomed to violence. 3 more shots exploded from the ridge overlooking the cemetery, and the stranger returned fire with deadly precision. "Run when I tell you," he called out, his voice steady despite the danger. "That ridge path leads straight into town." "I can't leave you," she protested, surprising herself. The stranger's face turned toward her, and for the first time, she saw him clearly sun-bronzed skin, eyes the color of a summer storm, a face weathered by years under the harsh western sun. "Name's Mason Wolcott, madam, and I'd appreciate not dying for nothing." A final shot rang out, followed by a distant cry and the sound of retreating hoofbeats. Mason cautiously stood, holstering his weapon with practiced ease. "Who were they?" Rose asked, her heart still thundering in her chest. "Likely Carson's boys," Mason replied, helping her to her feet. "They've been terrorizing every settlement between here and Tucson." His eyes fell to the fresh grave. "I'm sorry for your loss, madam." "Rose," she said softly. "Rose Valentino." "Mrs. Valentino," Mason acknowledged with a respectful tip of his hat. "We should get you back to town before they circle around." As they walked the dusty path toward Redemption, Rose clutched her shawl tightly around her shoulders. "You're not from around here," she observed. "Just passing through," he confirmed, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon. "Been tracking those men for 3 weeks now." "You're a lawman?" A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Not exactly. Let's just say I have personal reasons for wanting to see justice served." Rose studied him, his worn leather vest, the expertly maintained Colt at his hip, the way he carried himself like a man who'd seen too much. "Well, Mr. Wolcott, it seems I owe you my gratitude." "Don't thank me yet, Mrs. Valentino. Those men aren't known for giving up easily." When they reached the main street of Redemption, the townspeople stared openly at the pair, the widow in black and the dangerous-looking stranger. Rose was acutely aware of how it must appear, but propriety seemed a distant concern compared to having nearly lost her life. "I have a small ranch just outside town," Rose said as they paused outside the general store. "My husband left it to me, though most folks think a woman has no business running such a place." Mason's expression remained neutral. "And what do you think, Mrs. Valentino?" "I think I have little choice," she answered honestly. "It's all I have left." Something shifted in Mason's eyes, recognition, perhaps, or respect. "Those men might come looking. You shouldn't be alone. Are you offering your protection, Mr. Wolcott?" "For a spell," he said cautiously, "until I'm certain they've moved on." That evening, Rose led Mason to her modest ranch, a small main house, a barn, and a corral containing a handful of horses. The place showed signs of neglect. Richard had been sick for months before his passing, leaving little time for maintenance. "It's not much," Rose apologized as she lit a lantern in the kitchen. "But it's home." Mason removed his hat, revealing dark hair streaked with premature silver at the temples. "It's a fine place, madam." "Richard had big dreams for this land," she said, busying herself with preparing a simple meal. "Now I just hope to keep it." "How long were you married?" Mason asked, setting his saddlebags by the door. 5 years, Rose replied, the grief still fresh. "No children. Just me now." Mason nodded, understanding in his silence. "I'll check the perimeter before dark. Lock the doors behind me." When Mason returned, they shared a quiet meal of beans, cornbread, and coffee. Rose found herself studying his hands, calloused and strong, yet surprisingly gentle as they handled the chipped china cups. "You've been on your own a long while," she observed. Mason looked up, surprised by her perception. "What makes you say that?" "The way you carry yourself. Like a man who answers to no one." A faint smile crossed his face. "Observant, Mrs. Valentino." Rose, she corrected gently. If you're to be staying in my home, even temporarily, we might as well dispense with formalities. Rose, then, he conceded, her name sounding different in his deep voice. As night fell, Rose offered Mason a bedroll in the front room. I'd offer Richard's clothes, but… She trailed off. This is fine, Mason assured her. I've slept under worse conditions. Rose hesitated at the doorway to her bedroom. Thank you. For today, I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't been there. Get some rest, Mason replied simply. Dawn comes early. Rose did not sleep well. Dreams of gunfire and her husband's grave plagued her, intermingled with images of the stranger now sleeping under her roof. When she finally rose with the first light, she found Mason already awake, coffee brewing on the stove. You're an early riser, she commented, quickly pinning up her hair. Old habits, he replied, pouring her a cup of the strong brew. I've been thinking about your ranch. Rose raised an eyebrow. Oh, that south fence is nearly down, and your barn roof won't last another hard rain. She sighed, wrapping her hands around the warm cup. I'm aware. Richard had plans to repair them, but then he fell ill. I could help, Mason offered, surprising both of them. While I'm here. Rose studied him. Why would you do that? Mason looked out the window toward the distant mountains. Let's just say I've got my reasons for staying put a few days. Those men who shot at you are part of something bigger. And what about after you catch them? Rose asked quietly. His eyes met hers. I haven't thought that far ahead in a long while, madam. Over the next several days, Mason worked tirelessly on the ranch. Rose found herself watching him from the kitchen window as he mended fences, patched the barn roof, and even broke a wild Mustang that had been giving Richard trouble before his illness. The horse, a magnificent black stallion, seemed to recognize something kindred in Mason's spirit. In the evenings, they would share simple meals, their conversations gradually deepening. Rose learned that Mason had fought for the Union in the war, that he'd once had a family in Kansas before tragedy struck, and that he'd spent the years since wandering the territories, taking odd jobs, and occasionally tracking men like the ones who'd attacked her. They killed my brother, he confessed one night as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the desert in fiery hues. 2 years ago, he was a marshal in a small town in Colorado. Had a wife, 2 little ones. I'm sorry, Rose said softly, understanding the weight of such loss. I swore I'd find every last one of them. Mason continued, his voice low and controlled. Carson's the last. Him and his 3 remaining men. Rose reached out, her fingers brushing his weathered hand. Vengeance is a heavy burden to carry. Mason looked down at her hand on his, a complexity of emotions crossing his face. It's all I've had for a long time. And after, she pressed gently. His eyes met hers, vulnerability visible for just a moment. I don't know that there is an after, Rose. The days stretched into a week, then 2. No sign of Carson's gang, but neither of them mentioned Mason's eventual departure. The ranch began to thrive under their combined efforts. Rose taught school in town 3 days a week, and Mason would accompany her, watchful but increasingly integrated into the community's daily life. Not everyone welcomed his presence. Sheriff Donovan in particular viewed the stranger with suspicion, especially as rumors of Mason's mission reached his ears. We don't need vigilante justice in redemption, the sheriff warned one afternoon, cornering Mason outside the general store while Rose purchased supplies. Not looking for trouble, Sheriff, Mason replied evenly. Just keeping an eye on Mrs. Valentino. That's so. Donovan's eyes narrowed. Mighty convenient. A gunslinger appearing just when a widow inherits a prime piece of ranch land. Mason's expression hardened. You'd do well to watch your implications, Sheriff. The tension between them was interrupted by Rose's return. She sensed the hostility immediately. Is everything all right, gentlemen? Just having a friendly chat with Mr. Wolcott, Donovan said with forced pleasantness, reminding him that Redemption is a peaceful town. Mr. Wolcott has been nothing but helpful since my husband's passing, Rose replied with quiet dignity. I'd appreciate if the law showed him the same courtesy he's shown me. As they rode back to the ranch, Rose noticed Mason's troubled expression. The sheriff's wrong about you, she said. Is he? Mason replied, his voice distant. I've killed men, Rose. More than I care to count. That's not all you are, she insisted. That evening, a spring storm rolled across the desert, bringing rare and violent rain. They sat together by the fire, listening to water hammer against the newly repaired roof. The intimacy of being sheltered together while nature raged outside wasn't lost on either of them. "Tell me about him," Mason said suddenly. "Your husband." Rose looked up, surprised. "Richard? He was a good man. Kind. Ambitious. He believed this land would make us wealthy someday." She paused, twisting the simple gold band she still wore. "He wasn't a passionate man, but he was steady. We had respect." "You didn't love him?" Mason asked carefully. Rose considered this. "I did in my way, but it wasn't the kind they write about in novels." She met his gaze across the firelight. "What about you? Were you ever married?" "Once," Mason admitted. "Her name was Sarah. She and our daughter died in a fever outbreak while I was away fighting." "I'm sorry," Rose whispered. "It was a lifetime ago," he said, though his eyes told a different story. The rain continued into the night, and Rose found herself unable to sleep, the conversation with Mason replaying in her mind. When a particularly loud crash of thunder shook the house, she rose and wrapped herself in a shawl, intending to check that no windows had broken. She found Mason standing at the front window, watching the storm. He'd removed his shirt, and in the brief flashes of lightning, she could see the scars that marked his body wounds from battles both recent and long past. "You should be asleep," he said without turning. "So should you," she countered, moving to stand beside him. In the darkness, with only intermittent flashes of lightning to see by, Rose felt a boldness she might not have possessed in daylight. "Why are you really still here, Mason?" He turned to her then, his face illuminated momentarily by a brilliant flash. "You know why." The thunder that followed seemed to shake the very foundation of the house, and when it passed, Rose found herself in Mason's arms, his lips on hers with an urgency that matched the storm outside. Grief, loneliness, and newfound hope collided as they clung to each other, seeking solace and connection. When they finally parted, breathless, Mason rested his forehead against hers. "This isn't why I stayed," he whispered. "I need you to know that." "I know," she assured him, her hands framing his face. "I've been alone too long, Mason." "So have you." In the gray light of dawn, Rose woke to find Mason already dressed, staring out the bedroom window with tension visible in every line of his body. "What is it?" she asked, pulling the quilt around her. "Riders," he said grimly. "At least 4. Coming fast." Fear gripped Rose as she hurried to dress. "Carson's men, most likely." Mason checked his revolver, his movements efficient and precise. "Stay inside, away from the windows." "I won't hide while you face them alone," Rose insisted, retrieving Richard's shotgun from the cabinet. "This is my home." Mason looked as if he might argue, but a grudging respect showed in his eyes. "Just stay back. These men don't fight fair." They positioned themselves strategically, Mason at the front door, Rose covering the side window with the shotgun. The riders approached in a cloud of dust, slowing as they neared the house. "Wolcott," a voice called out. "We know you're in there. The widow too. What do you want, Carson?" Mason shouted back. "You've been hunting my boys for months now. Time we ended this dance." Mason glanced at Rose. "He's right about one thing, it ends today." "Be careful," she whispered. With deliberate movements, Mason stepped onto the porch, his revolver held loosely at his side. Rose kept the shotgun trained on the mounted men, her heart pounding. For riders faced the house hard-faced men with eyes that had seen too much violence and caused more than their share. The leader, a broad-shouldered man with a jagged scar across his cheek, smirked confidently. "Finally caught up with you, Wolcott," Carson called. "Been an interesting chase." "It's over, Carson," Mason replied, his voice steady. "There's a marshal and 5 deputies waiting in town. They know you're here." Carson laughed. "Nice try. We paid the sheriff a visit last night. He won't be interfering." Rose felt a chill at the implication. Poor Donovan, for all his suspicions, hadn't deserved whatever fate these men had delivered. "This is between us," Mason continued. "Let the woman go." "The woman," Carson mused. "Heard you've grown mighty fond of the widow. Gotten domestic, have you?" The feared Mason Wolcott, playing house. "Last chance to ride away," Mason warned, his hand hovering near his holster. Carson's smile faded. "You killed my brother in Denver. Shot him down in the street like a dog." "After he murdered a family of settlers," Mason countered. including 2 children. The tension stretched between them like a bowstring pulled too tight. Rose held her breath, fingers steady on the trigger of the shotgun. "I'm taking you back to hang, Wolcott," Carson declared. "But first, I'm going to burn this place to the ground." With the widow inside, the first shot came from one of Carson's men, a wild, hasty bullet that splintered the porch railing. Mason drew and fired in one fluid motion, and the man toppled from his horse. All hell broke loose. Carson and his remaining men scattered, firing as they sought cover. Mason rolled behind a water barrel as bullets thudded into the house. Rose fired the shotgun at a man trying to circle behind, the blast catching him in the shoulder and sending him sprawling. "Get back inside," Mason shouted to her between shots. Instead, Rose moved to a better position, reloading the shotgun with trembling hands. A bullet shattered the window above her head, showering her with glass, but she held her ground. The gunfight seemed to last forever, though it was likely only minutes. When the smoke cleared, 2 of Carson's men lay still in the dust. The third was wounded, clutching his side as he tried to crawl toward his dropped weapon. Carson himself was pinned down behind the water trough, exchanging shots with Mason. "You can't win this, Wolcott," he shouted. "Even if you kill me, there'll be others." "There won't be you," Mason replied grimly, firing again. Rose watched in horror as Carson suddenly broke cover, not toward Mason but toward her. She raised the shotgun, but he was too fast, tackling her to the ground. The weapon discharged harmlessly into the air as Carson pressed a knife to her throat. "Drop it, Wolcott," he commanded, "or she dies right here." Mason froze, his revolver aimed steadily at Carson's head. "Let her go. This is between us." "Drop it." Carson pressed the blade harder, drawing a thin line of blood from Rose's neck. With obvious reluctance, Mason slowly lowered his weapon to the ground. "Kick it away," Carson ordered, his breath hot against Rose's ear. Mason complied, sending the revolver spinning into the dust. "Now let her go." "I don't think so," Carson snarled. "She's my ticket out of here." He began backing away, dragging Rose with him. "My horse is just over there. We're going to take a little ride, the widow and I. You follow, she dies." "Mason," Rose gasped, trying to stay calm despite the knife at her throat. "It's going to be all right, Rose," Mason said, his eyes never leaving Carson's. "I promise you that." Carson laughed. Big promises from an unarmed man. What happened next occurred so quickly Rose could barely comprehend it. As Carson backed toward his horse, his foot caught on the outstretched arm of one of his fallen men. He stumbled slightly, his grip on Rose loosening just enough. She drove her elbow backward with all her strength, connecting with Carson's ribs. He grunted in pain, the knife wavering just enough for her to twist away. As she fell forward, Mason was already moving, producing a small derringer from his boot. 2 shots rang out. Carson fired wildly as he fell, his bullet grazing Mason's shoulder. Mason's shot was more precise, striking Carson squarely in the chest. The outlaw dropped to his knees, disbelief etched on his weathered face. "You," he wheezed, blood bubbling from his lips. "You don't look like a man who's found peace." "I haven't," Mason agreed, helping Rose to her feet. "Not yet." Carson slumped forward, his final breath escaping in a rattle. The sudden silence was deafening after the chaos of gunfire. Rose touched the shallow cut on her neck, her legs unsteady. "Is it over?" Mason nodded, examining her wound with gentle fingers. "It's over." The wounded outlaw still lived, though he'd lost consciousness from blood loss. They bound him securely and loaded him onto a wagon to take to town, along with the bodies of his companions. When they reached Redemption, they found the town in turmoil. Sheriff Donovan had indeed been attacked, but had survived, though badly beaten. A telegraph had been sent to the territorial marshal, who was expected within days. The doctor tended to Mason's shoulder and Rose's neck, pronouncing both injuries minor. As they sat on the doctor's porch afterward, watching the townsfolk deal with the aftermath, Rose noticed a new quietness in Mason. "What happens now?" she asked softly. Mason stared at the distant horizon. "Carson was the last. My hunt is done." "And?" she prompted when he fell silent. "And I don't know what comes next," he admitted. "I've lived with vengeance for so long. I'm not sure who I am without it." Rose took his hand, her fingers intertwining with his. You could find out. Here. Mason turned to her, surprise evident in his expression. You'd want that? After all this. I brought danger to your door, Rose. Danger found me long before you arrived, she countered. You brought something else entirely. What's that? Hope, she said simply. The possibility of a future I hadn't dared imagine after Richard died. Mason's expression softened, but doubt remained in his eyes. I've done terrible things, Rose. Things that haunt me still. We all carry burdens, she replied. The question is whether we carry them alone. The territorial marshal arrived 2 days later, taking statements from everyone involved and the surviving outlaw into custody. Mason's history as a bounty hunter came to light, as did his personal vendetta against Carson's gang. To Rose's relief, the marshal determined that Mason had acted in self-defense and in the protection of others. The territory owes you a debt, Wolcott, the marshal said as they stood outside the jail. Those men have terrorized settlements from here to Colorado. Mason nodded, uncomfortable with the praise. Just glad it's finished. That evening, as they prepared to return to the ranch, Pastor Miller approached them on the street. Mrs. Valentino, Mr. Wolcott, he greeted them. I was hoping to speak with you both. Rose exchanged a glance with Mason. Of course, Pastor. I understand from Sheriff Donovan that you've been staying at Mrs. Valentino's ranch, Mr. Wolcott. The pastor began, his expression carefully neutral. That's right, Mason confirmed, his posture stiffening slightly. I mean no offense, Pastor Miller continued, but the town has begun to talk. A widow and a single man living under the same roof. Rose felt heat rising to her cheeks. Mr. Wolcott has been helping restore my ranch, Pastor, and protecting me from the very real danger that, as we've seen, existed. I understand completely, the pastor assured her. But now that the danger has passed, propriety must be considered. For your reputation, Mrs. Valentino. Mason's jaw tightened. I'll gather my things when we return. That won't be necessary, Rose said firmly, surprising both men. Unless, of course, you're proposing an alternative, Pastor? Pastor Miller blinked. I hadn't, because Mr. Wolcott and I have discussed the possibility of marriage, Rose continued, her heart racing as she spoke words they had not, in fact, discussed at all. Given time to properly court, of course. Mason stared at her, astonishment evident in his expression. The pastor cleared his throat. I see. Well, that would certainly be appropriate. Though perhaps in the meantime, Mr. Wolcott might find lodging in town. Of course, Mason agreed, his eyes never leaving Rose's face. That would be the proper thing. After the pastor departed, Mason turned to Rose. Marriage? He asked quietly. Rose felt a moment of panic. Had she presumed too much? I apologize for speaking out of turn. I just couldn't bear the thought of you leaving because of small-minded gossip. A slow smile spread across Mason's face, the first true smile she'd seen from him. I'm not objecting to the idea, Rose. Just surprised to hear it announced before I'd had the chance to properly ask. Relief and joy bubbled through her. Are you saying you would have asked? I've been trying to find the courage, he admitted. A man with my past has no right to ask a woman like you for a future. Maybe that's not for you to decide, Rose replied softly. The following Sunday, Rose persuaded Mason to accompany her to church services, his first in many years, he confessed. As they sat in the hard wooden pew, listening to Pastor Miller speak of redemption and new beginnings, Rose noticed the discomfort on Mason's face. When the congregation bowed their heads for prayer, Mason remained stiffly upright, his expression troubled. Is something wrong? Rose whispered. I don't remember how, he admitted quietly. It's been so long since I prayed. I wouldn't even know where to begin. Rose looked around at the townspeople, many of whom had initially regarded Mason with suspicion, but who had gradually come to accept his presence. They were good people, mostly, but how many truly understood the weight of the burdens Mason carried? They don't know how to pray for the things you've seen, she whispered back. The lives you've taken, the brother you lost. Mason's eyes met hers, vulnerable in a way she'd rarely witnessed. No, he agreed. They don't. Rose slipped her hand into his. Then we'll learn together, she promised. One day at a time. Something shifted in Mason's expression, a release, perhaps, or the first tentative acceptance that his journey of vengeance had truly ended, replaced by something far more frightening, hope. In the months that followed, Rose and Mason did indeed court properly, with Mason taking a room above the general store in town. He found work as a part-time deputy, a position that initially raised eyebrows, but proved valuable when a band of cattle rustlers targeted local ranches. The ranch flourished under their combined efforts. Mason's skill with horses attracted buyers from as far as Santa Fe, and Rose's teaching position expanded to include more students as the town grew. They were married the following spring, a simple ceremony in the church with the entire town in attendance. Even the territorial marshal returned for the occasion, bringing news that the last of Carson's associates had been sentenced. That night, as they stood on the porch of what was now their home, Mason pulled Rose close. "I never thought I'd find peace," he confessed. "Not after everything." "Have you?" she asked, searching his face. "Found peace. Getting closer every day," he replied, kissing her softly. "With your help." 3 years later, the Wolcott Ranch had become one of the most prosperous in the territory. Their daughter Sarah, named for Mason's first wife, toddled across the yard chasing butterflies while Rose watched from the porch, her hand resting on her swollen belly where their second child grew. Mason rode up, returning from town with supplies and mail. The lines of constant tension that had once marked his face had softened, though he still carried a watchfulness that would likely never fully disappear. "Letter from the marshal," he said, dismounting and lifting Sarah into his arms. "They're naming a new territorial judge next month. He's recommending me for the position." Rose raised her eyebrows. "A judge? You?" Mason laughed, a sound that had once been rare, but now came easily. "Ironic, isn't it? The former bounty hunter administering justice from behind a bench instead of the barrel of a gun. Are you considering it?" Rose asked, accepting his kiss as he joined her on the porch. "I am," he admitted, "though it would mean moving to the territorial capital." Rose nodded thoughtfully. "A fresh start, perhaps. For all of us." That night, as they prepared for bed, Mason paused by the window, looking out at the stars scattered across the vast Arizona sky. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked suddenly. "Taking a chance on me?" Rose wrapped her arms around him from behind, resting her cheek against his back. "Never. Not for a single moment. I was so lost when I found you," he murmured, consumed by vengeance, empty of everything else. "And now," she prompted. Mason turned in her embrace, his hands cradling her face with infinite tenderness. "Now I understand what it means to be found." In the quiet darkness of their bedroom, they knelt together beside their bed, hands clasped, and prayed for their children, for their future, for the souls of those they had lost, and even for those who had wronged them. The words came easier now, after years of practice, the weight of guilt and grief gradually lightening with each passing season. They had learned together, just as Rose had promised that day in church. And in that learning, they had found something neither had dared hope for: redemption, not just in name like the town where they'd met, but in the truest sense of the word. When they finally slept, wrapped in each other's arms, the nightmares that had once plagued Mason visited less frequently. The past would always be there, but it no longer defined them. Instead, they were shaped by the family they'd built, the love they'd found, and the future they faced together. In the wild expanse of the Arizona territory, where law and chaos still waged their eternal battle, Rose and Mason Wolcott had carved out something precious and enduring, a home built on understanding, forgiveness, and second chances. And that, perhaps, was the greatest miracle of all.